Well, hello and welcome to another clinical case vignette with Dr. Childress here. So today I'm going to be discussing the Jones family. This is with a targeted parent father and an allied parent mother, with ages 8 years old. And so we're going to be discussing the borderline variant of the pathology, vulnerable dark triad. And with this particular family, there were the false allegations to CPS and a domestic violence restraining order, temporary restraining order, which are common features of this particular variant. So to begin with here, with the Jones family, so the basic structure here was we have an allied mother and a targeted parent father with two children, an 8-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old daughter, so relatively young. And they're in the early development of the pathology. So they're within the first 2 years after the separation and divorce. And this is a simple sort of family structure. There's no step families and no extended family that I'm going to be discussing today. And the presenting problem here in this family is at the time of the marital separation, the mother filed for a domestic violence restraining order, and the father was prohibited from being with the children for the first 6 months after the separation. So she got a temporary restraining order that restricted the father's access, and then when eventually the restraining order moved from temporary to permanent, it didn't. Okay, that the mother either dropped the restraining order allegations or the court did not grant them. So, but then by that time, the pathology is kind of entrenched with the children, and so it begins to proceed on the fearfulness, child protection issues. In addition, there are two child protection services investigations that have been conducted into the father's parenting, and both were returned as unfounded. So the father's had a disrupted ability to bond with his children after the separation because of the domestic violence restraining order and then the CPS investigations. So both children now are refusing custody time with their father, stating that they are afraid of him, and the child transfers are marked with high child protest and resistance, and nurturing support for the mother for the children's fears and the alleged dangers posed by the father. So the assessment with this, and again, I would always start with the parenting practices rating scale. Now, that's not an assessment, it's a documentation instrument. So you want to do a parenting assessment and find out what's going on with the father's parenting because there's concern that there's abusive range or something's problematic with his parenting. So assess for that. I have another YouTube video on assessing parenting, applied behavioral analysis, and behavior chain interviews. And then you categorize it based on your clinical impressions, your clinical judgment, as to whether it's level 1, clearly abusive. Now, it wouldn't be in this case because we've had 2 CPS investigations. It came back unfounded. So it's not level 1. It's probably not level 2 if the CPS has been involved and they're not concerned, but it could be severely problematic just under the threshold for CPS. So you'd want to assess to see whether it's severely problematic and in what way, because we're going to put it on a treatment plan and fix it if it is. So identify what the problem is. Or are we talking about a normal range dad? But there may be some issues with his parenting. I mean, he's part of a marriage. He may be more structured and rule bound than we might prefer in a perfect world. But that's, you put it on a treatment plan. You tell dad to relax a little bit. He does. And so it's normal range that we can provide some adjustments on whatever difficulties there are. Or is it just normal range and healthy? Okay, the dad's just a normal range dad doing normal range kind of parenting things. And so we want that documented for clarity because we're going to be in the world of a potential delusional thought disorder or persecutory delusion. So we want to establish reality so that we can then deal with the persecutory thought disorder with confidence. And so we want to vet the dad that he's not a dangerous parent. The moment we have that, then we can move to protect the child. So we'll want to do applied behavioral analysis and behavior chain interviews with problematic, parenting. We interview the mother, talk with probably just the eldest daughter, talk to the two daughters together, probably 8 and 5, and get a reporting of what they're afraid of with their father or what happened, specific episodes. You want to get specific on it. And you select 2 or 3 or even 1. There may not even be 1, but you select the most serious incidents of father-daughter conflict, and those might be reported by the mother. And then you conduct an applied behavioral analysis with the father and the child, using behavior chain interviewing to identify the cues and the triggers for the conflict. This might be a little iffy if you're talking about a past event and you have a 8-year-old and a 5-year-old regarding memory and stuff, but you will still want to do an applied behavioral analysis with the conflict. Now, I love the Roberts apperception test for children, and the 8-year-old is within the age range. The 5-year-old is just entering the age range for this, but I'm not sure I would not do an applied behavior or Roberts for the diagnostic assessment, but I would keep it in the background, especially for the oldest daughter. If I have concerns about how she's handling the stresses or anything going on, then I'd be thinking about a Roberts apperception test to give me insight into that. Now, any court-involved clinical assessment for attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent here, we've got 2 girls saying they're afraid of the father, is a risk assessment for child abuse to a differential diagnosis for each parent. So in this matter, we would have, is dad abusing the children in some way, in which case, he's causing the child's fear of him and stuff, and that would be an abusive range parenting by the father causing authentic attachment pathology. Or do we have the mother who's creating this persecutory delusion in the children, the dad's normal range, but the children are afraid of him, and a false or factitious attachment pathology in the child for secondary gain to the mother? And in the borderline pattern, we're looking, the most likely secondary gain is going to be a regulatory object using the child to manage their own anxiety, rather than the narcissistic variant where the primary secondary gain is spousal abuse of the normal range targeted parent mother, using the child as a weapon. Over here with the borderline spectrum variant, the more likely secondary gain is regulatory object to the mother. And so a court-involved risk assessment for child abuse needs to be completed within 6 to 8 weeks. I mean, talk about that. These custody evaluations that go on for 6 to 9 months are far, far too long. This is potential child abuse. We need a diagnosis back within, I would prefer 4 to 6 weeks, but 6 to 8 weeks would be reasonable, okay, or expected. For 2 children, ages 8 and 5, a mom and a dad, 4 to 6 weeks, we can return a diagnosis, and you get second opinion on that through telehealth so that the court can rely on the diagnosis being returned. Let each parent, let the mom appoint a consultant, let the dad appoint a consultant, get somebody to conduct the assessment with the 2 second opinion and get the diagnosis that the court can rely on for its decision making, and that we can use for developing a treatment plan right away. Don't let this metastasize into this big conflict that goes on for years and destroys these 2 little girls' lives. Let's get on it. Let's diagnose it. Let's treat it. Let's fix it. Okay. Diagnosis guides treatment. So now one of the features about this is the mother is going to be claiming that the father is an insensitive parent in some way, that he's not sufficiently in tune with the child. And typically she will use the word abuse somehow, that he's abusive with the children. And when you go to explore what the abuse is, it's some sort of not being sufficiently sensitive as a parent. And this is where it becomes really important not to judge value systems, but to judge parenting. Okay. And in the absence of child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, their personal values, and their religious values. And in the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. And to restrict either parent's time or involvement with the child would damage that child's attachment bond to that parent, thereby harming the child and harming the parent. So let me talk about that. So you may have normal range parenting. The mother's more permissive, the father's more structured. She's going to view the structure of the father as being insufficiently sensitive, and he's going to view her permissive as being neglectfully permissive. Whereas they might both be in the normal range, but they just are seeing the other one based on their own value system. And so we want to guard against being put in a position of evaluating which parent is the better parent and deserves the child. And that's what mom's going to want to put forward. She's going to put forward an argument that she deserves the child because she's the better parent, which is what she thinks the whole system is. She doesn't realize the value of the child bonding to both parents. The child is an object. Who gets the couch? Who gets the television set? Who gets the child? Okay, well, I'm the better parent. And you will often get these allegations that the father was uninvolved. Okay, the father was uninvolved, before I was the primary nurturer and primary parent. Well, that's a false argument because you were in a marriage at the time and you had your roles and things. But the father wants to be involved with his two girls, and that's a valuable bond. And so it's not about who deserves to have the children. It's how do we foster a healthy, normal range family. And the family is simply transitioning. It's transitioning from an intact family that was united by the marriage, where the kids could kind of float around in this little bubble, to now the parents aren't getting along. So now they're going to live in separate houses, but we still have a family that's now united by the child's bond to both parents. Okay, that's a healthy separated family. What we want to avoid is the pathological cutoff family. So when the parents has too much fighting and conflict and it rips the family apart, now the child's on one side or the other. So the question becomes, which parent is most likely to lead this family into a healthy separated family versus a cutoff family? And we can tell just from the mother's arguments or declarations to the court, she wants to lead this into a cutoff, that we need to protect the children from the father. He needs to be on supervised visitation or something like that. And she's going to lead it this way. Whereas when we talk to the father, he's going to lead it into a healthy separated, where the child's bonding to both parents. So that's one of the features, and that's one of the symptom features you will get from the mother, is the idea that she's arguing which one of them is the better parent and deserves the child, as if the child's like part of the property that we're going to divide up after the divorce. And so she doesn't understand the value of the father-daughter relationship. Now, another feature about this is you cannot compare mothers to fathers in the lives of their daughters and sons, because each one of those relationships is of unique value to the child. And there's 4 types of relationship in the family. They depend on the gender of the parent and gender of the child. 2 of them are cross-gender relationships. Those are your high affection bonds. So that's mother-daughter or mother-son and father-daughter. 2 of them are same-gender bonds. These are your values and identity bonds. That's father-son and mother-daughter. So here we have the mother on the identity bonds with her daughters. So values and identity there. And that's a really important bond because these daughters are going to be using that template of their mother-daughter for when they become mothers with their own children. And so they're downloading sort of the attachment, mother-daughter or mother-child attachment networks for when they become the mother. That's the identity bond. Now, the father is on the high affection cross-gender bond, the father-daughter bond. So then that's going to be used as a template for selecting a mate. So these girls are going to go out into the world and look for, a husband or partner who's going to make them feel the way their dad made them feel. Okay, so we want these girls to feel loved by their dad so that they can go out and match that when they are adults and feel that love. And so we have two different types of relationship here that have uniquely valuable components for the two girls. And so it's not a matter of which parent is the better parent or he's too strict and I'm more nurturing. It as long as there's no child abuse, then parents have the right to parent, and to restrict either parent's time or involvement will damage the attachment bond and thereby harm the child. So the only thing that clinical psychology is worried about is there child abuse? And when we have a child rejecting a parent like this, saying, I'm afraid of dad, yes, there is. It's either the dad's producing authentic attachment pathology, the children seeking to flee from him, and not instead of bonding to them, they're trying to get away. Well, is he abusing the children? That's what mom's saying. Or is the mother creating a false pathology in the children, a factitious disorder imposed on the child, a factitious anxiety, and a persecutory delusion, a fixed and false belief that they're being malevolently treated in some way by the normal range parenting of the father. So this is required reading. Okay, for anybody working in the family courts, Tronick and Gold, The Power of Discord. We always fix things. Repair is where the action is. It's not the conflict that's the problem. We need to fix it. We need to repair. And one of the important things about the research of Dr. Tronick on the still face is that what they've discovered or what they found was that in healthy parent-child relationships, the relationship was out of sync 70% of the time. So 70% of the time, they're having trouble, the power of discord. And only 30% of the time are they attuned and in sync. And that's healthy, that's normal, and it's valuable for healthy child development. So Tronick and Gold, The Power of Discord, is mandatory reading for all mental health professionals. I'd recommend it for parents in the family courts. The other thing is we want to do a parenting assessment relative to the father. So I describe that elsewhere. I'm not going to describe the parenting assessment we would do with the father to make sure there's no child abuse and that the child's safe. And then we can have more confidence as we look at the delusional thought disorder and the factitious disorder. Because if dad's a normal range parent, these two girls should want their father's affection, especially, yeah. And so they want their dad's attention and to feel wonderful and special. And so if they don't, if they're seeking to, that's a factitious pathology because he's a normal range parent. And so they should be bonding into him. So factitious disorder, and I describe this in these diagnostic assessments as well, diagnostic series. A factitious disorder is based on a rule out. So we rule out the authentic disorder, and that means it's a factitious disorder. So we get, with the borderline spectrum, we're looking at both the delusional disorder, which we can diagnose using a mental status exam of thought perception. So that's an affirmative diagnosis. Yep, it's there. And the factitious attachment pathology, which is made based on rule out. We rule out the parent, the father in this case, as being abusive. He's a normal range parent. Then we rule that out and we got the factitious disorder. Two major psychiatric disorders, either one or both represent the child's psychological abuse diagnosis. So here we have the family. This is what a genogram would look like for the family. And This is family systems, basic family systems. So I recommend everybody in the family court start drawing up a genogram with this. The genograms will be helpful when we start getting into step families and all the different relationships and starts to get more complex, because they bring organization to understanding the family. And that's what we need to do for disorganized attachment, is bring organization. So this is the first level of that. So males are represented as squares, females as circles, and this just represents the basic structure. Targeted father, light mother, and we have Anna and Sophia there. So let's understand the domain a little bit of what we're dealing with. Now, personality pathology, the terms narcissistic, borderline, all of those classifications of personality pathology come from the 1930s and 40s, kind of up in the 50s and 60s. But they are old ways of conceptualizing this pattern that we would see. The more appropriately for treatment is to think of the narcissistic and borderline personality pathology as unresolved trauma. Now, they're useful for the symptoms and all the research we have on them and stuff, and the constellation of symptoms. So they're useful conceptually. However, for treatment, we should be thinking of them as unresolved trauma. And then for actual understanding, we should be thinking of them as the dark personalities. So the narcissist variant is going to be the dark triad and dark tetrad. That's narcissistic, psychopathic, and Machiavellian manipulation. And then you add sadism for the dark tetrad. So it's a very malevolent human. And the spousal abuse concerns are high with the dark triad and dark tetrad. For the borderline variant, we're talking about the vulnerable dark triad. That's vulnerable narcissism, factor 2 psychopathy, which is the manipulative part, and then the borderline personality characteristics. And that's going to have a higher anxiety and higher false allegations component to it. So it's better conceptually to think about the dark personalities, which are subclinical. They're not diagnoses, they're subclinical constellations of these personality features. So it's better to think of them that way than it is narcissistic and borderline. So here's from Bonfa, Arujo, and Shermer, 2024, really recent. I'm talking about the vulnerable dark triad. So the vulnerable dark triad, VDT, i.e. factor 2 psychopathy, that's your manipulative, highly manipulative, vulnerable narcissism. So the dark triad, dark tetrad has a grandiose narcissism. For this pattern, we have a vulnerable narcissism that everybody needs to pay attention to me because I'm vulnerable. And then we have borderline personality pathology. That's going to be the splitting is going to be very characteristic. We will see the polarization, the splitting is going to be characteristic, as well as abandonment fears. And that's where we get the mother using the child as a regulatory object, because the spousal relationship, and so she's going to address her abandonment fears by, the children aren't abandoning me, you can leave, but I've got the children and they will never abandon me because I'm the wonderful mother, and so we're going to get that abandonment fears kind of motivating things going forward. High anxiety, unstable self, we're going to get a number of features related to that borderline personality traits. And so the VDT, vulnerable dark triad, was proposed over 10 years ago as a counterpart to the dark triad, narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellian manipulation, combining socially undesirable behavior and emotionally vulnerable traits. This interplay of vulnerable behaviors can lead to complex patterns of emotional instability, a fragile sense of self, relationship difficulties, and manipulative tendencies. And it's those manipulative tendencies that are we need to be aware of as we do our assessment. and decision making surrounding the child and family. So a little bit more specific here, they describe that the first trait of VDT is factor 2 psychopathy. Psychopathy is a personality disorder characterized by interpersonal manipulation, callousness, a lack of empathy, and impulsivity. So that again, these personalities, dark personalities, are the most manipulative people on the planet. They are master manipulators. So that's where if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get caught because they're really, really good at manipulating other people. The second trait of the VDT is vulnerable narcissism. Vulnerable narcissism is characterized by an underlying fragility and sensitivity, often camouflaged beneath a facade of modesty and self-doubt. So what the borderline presents as, okay, well, we'll start with the narcissist, the dark triad, dark tetrad. They seek allies with their grandiose sort of elevated expression of emotion, and they're just, very dominating and very assertive, and people just join with them because they're so wonderful to be around, and so it's a very expansive kind of manipulation. The borderline strategy is to go vulnerable and hurt, and oh my goodness, there's people abusing me, and then people come to protect them. Okay, and so they have different strategies for manipulating other people. And the borderline version, the vulnerable dark triad, is more about presenting as that facade of modesty and self-doubt, and then the underlying fragility and sensitivity. And then the borderline personality represents the final piece of the VDT. And the borderline personality is characterized by pervasive instability of emotions, self-image, interpersonal relationships, and behavior. And it's that instability of emotions that they use the child to stabilize themselves at. So they're using the child to regulate their unstable emotions surrounding the divorce and the spousal separation. So here we have the trauma reenactment narrative. And so trauma replicates pattern. The mother has unresolved trauma in her brain networks. Potentially unresolved sex abuse trauma is the one I'd be worried about, just based on patterns. But we have unresolved trauma. Now, the actual pattern that we have for this family in reality is parent-child-parent. However, the trauma reenactment narrative is that the mother adds the adjectives abusive parent for the father, victimized child for the child, and protective parent in her role. And that's critical, that protective parent role for the mother. So let's talk about the misattribution of anxiety, which is the key to understanding what's happening in this pattern. So let me talk. The attachment system is the brain system that governs love and bonding throughout the lifespan, including grief and loss. So when the father and mother, the husband and wife, get married, he's in the bonding system, the attachment networks of that. And so the attachment system, it bonds with him. It's glowing active during all that romancing phase, and she's very seductive. The borderlines are very seductive, might have used sexuality as a verb to seduce, and she knows how to seduce the guy and be really wonderful. And so they marry and bond. Then once they're married, the attachment system grows more quiet, and she begins to work out her relationship stuff. Potentially that she's not valuable and worthwhile, and she creates that. She's afraid she's going to be rejected, and she creates the situation where he rejects her, and then she blames it, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. Potentially she has an anxious ambivalent attachment, and he needs a lot of affection and a lot of attention, whereas he has an anxious avoidant attachment that he's more cerebral and distant, and then that creates problems. Emotionally focused therapy would be good for that during their marriage. But we have this dormancy in the attachment networks during the marriage. However, when there's the separation and the divorce, the attachment networks glow warm again because they mediate grief and loss. So as the attachment networks grow warm and start to meet, the trauma of the unresolved trauma also glows into being. So the mother feels an authentic anxiety, but it's embedded in the anxiety networks, in the anxiety knots within the attachment networks that have elevated, but she doesn't understand why she feels anxiety. She feels the anxiety. She's doing, but why? And it has something to do with the child, her own trauma. And she goes, it's the child. It's the child. I need to protect the child. And that's the tumble into the delusional persecutory delusion, that she needs to protect the child because the child's being malevolently treated in some way. The child is being malevolently treated in some way by the bad man. That's her trauma reenactment, and it's overlaid now with reality. It's just, parent, child, parent, but she's seeing a abusive parent, victimized child, and protective parent from her own unresolved trauma. So what we have here is we have the misattribution of anxiety for her. The unresolved trauma represents high anxiety that's locked in the attachment networks, the internal working models or schemas, and the attachment system, because it manages all aspects of love and bonding, including grief and loss, it glows warm when there begins that separation and divorce. So when married, the husband is in the love and bonding system of the of attachment, and the trauma is dormant. But with the divorce, the attachment system activates, and with it, the unresolved trauma anxiety that the attachment networks contain. And with the reactivation of anxiety that's embedded in the attachment networks, the mother authentically feels anxiety. And so when you're talking with her, she will be really scared for the child's well-being, but she doesn't know why. So when you ask her, why is she scared? There's no there. And that's a discrepancy you're looking for on the mental status exam, that there's no linear logical reasoning for her anxiety. It's an emotional reasoning. She goes sideways. At some point, she goes sideways, and that indicates where the trauma is, and that we're now activating from or discussing her unresolved trauma issues. And so she doesn't know why. And she winds up misattributing the anxiety as being related to a present danger, the current child, rather than the past unresolved trauma of herself as a child. So there's a bit of confusion about what represents her and what represents the child. And this will involve a psychological feature called projective identification. This is so characteristic of this particular pattern. The borderline spectrum mother, vulnerable dark triad, unresolved trauma. Projective identification is the way she regulates her anxiety through the child, using the child as a regulatory object. So let me explain it. The mother induces the anxiety in the child and then nurtures her own elevated anxiety induced in the child. So what she's doing is she's projecting her anxiety into the child. She's actually creating her anxiety into the child, externalizing it. And she creates it in and inserts it in the child. And then she identifies with the anxiety that's in the child and soothes and regulates her own anxiety by offering comfort and protection to the child. So that role for the mother of the protective parent and offering comfort to the child is critical to her for regulating her anxiety. So when you first encounter this, she will present as the protective parent for the supposedly abused child. Now, when you come back to her after doing the assessment and say, you know what, we're not seeing that the dad is dangerous, you will see her activate even more because you're threatening to take that protective parent role away from her, and she needs that to regulate her own anxiety. So when I say there's like 6 sessions that I would typically recommend, just Generally, we meet with the mom in this case first to acquire her information, do a mental status exam, see what's going on. We'd meet with the dad to check out his versions of the abusive incidents. We'd meet with the two kids to find out what they're thinking and what their concerns are. Then we'd meet with the father and the two kids to see actually the symptoms in display. Then if the dad's normal range, there's no child abuse, this is the mother adding her fears and concerns to the situation, then we meet with the mother and explain that to her, because that's respectful to do. We're giving the feedback from our assessment. We're informing her that the dad's not dangerous, that the children are not at risk. Now, all normal range parents, if you go into the mom and say, we've done a good assessment, we've got like doctors involved, we looked at the situation, the father presents no risk to your daughters, and we want a normal and healthy relationship with the daughters. All normal range moms will be so relieved. They will be so happy that their daughters can have a good relationship with the dad, because they know how important that is, because they had a good relationship with their dad. And so they want that relationship. And they will be relieved that the daughters are not being malevolently treated in some way by the father, and that the mental health people have. This mother will not. Okay, this mother will continue to argue that the children are a danger. She wants the children to be at risk. She wants the children to be abused, because that she's using that to regulate her own anxiety. She needs the victimized child so she can be the protective parent. And that's that protective parent role that is the regulatory object in projective identification. So when you're diagnosing it, that's what you want to look at. As you come through, you get a confirmation of your diagnosis when you give her the feedback, and you see her, and she'll start to activate up and up. And she'll be motivated for the children to be abused. This is a mother who wants her children to have been abused by the father, so that she can then get possession of the children, a secondary gain to that. So with the trauma reenactment narrative here, we're going to have abusive parent, victimized child, protective parent. Those three adjectives are not actual reality. Those are the factitious or the disorder, those with the trauma reenactment narrative. And the protective parent role is the most vital for this, because she's using that to regulate her own trauma anxiety. So the diagnosis here, we would want the parenting practices rating scale for the father, for the targeted parent, looking at levels 1, 2, 3, or 4, and we want to rule out abusive parenting. That's step number one. If we got a child who's seeking to flee a parent, let's rule out abusive parenting by that parent. Then we move into the persecutory delusion. We would want a mental status exam of thought and perception on the mother. Run it down, linear logical reasoning. She's not going to be linear logical. She's going to move sideways into emotional associational thinking, it's called. Emotional associational thinking, and that's when you'll have the delusion. If you hold her back, she will begin to dysregulate, and you'll get collapse into, potentially a dissociative state, mild dissociative state in your set. I typically don't go there. The moment I get the delusion and it's clear that we have a thought disorder, then I will allow her to go into the thought disorder, and that'll give me all the features of her thought disorder, where the trauma was, what she's worried about, and everything. But if I'm worried whether it's reality-based or not, I could stay on the mental status exam. Then we want a response to intervention that fixes the problem, any problem with the dad, so attachment pathology. Okay, all attachment pathology, attachment system is a motivational system. All motivational systems, eating, pain, pleasure, sex, attachment, have a direction to them. That's what makes them a motivational system, not a regulatory system. Regulatory systems go up and down around a set point. Motivational systems motivate towards a direction. The attachment system always motivates the child to bond to the parent, because the other motivational direction is death by starvation and predation. That's the origins of a primary motivational system for bonding. And so we always, now when there's a barrier to that, the child will emit protest behavior, characteristic patterns, anxious ambivalent or anxious avoidant, based on the parenting or barrier. But when we remove the barrier, the child bonds right back in because that's the direction. And so what we do, a response to intervention, is we remove any barrier and we should see the child bond back in. If we remove the barrier and the child is still seeking to flee, that's a false or factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child for secondary gain to the allied parent, the mother. The secondary gain is to manipulate the court's decisions on child custody. And so she's very manipulative. And so she's got domestic violence restraining order, temporary, to get, and she manipulated the system that way. She got a couple CPS investigations. She manipulated the system that way. And so, she's producing this pathology in the child to manipulate the court. And the court goes, wait, if the children are afraid of the father and we got these allegations, is there actual child abuse here? So the court becomes reluctant to force the children over to be with their father. And the court needs an accurate diagnosis from the mental health system that the father's fine, the mother has persecutory thought disorder, to guide the court's decision making so that the court can understand what the pathology is and do the right thing. But any diagnosis into the legal system is going to be a disputed diagnosis. If you come back with child abuse by the mother and her attorney are going to dispute that diagnosis. So get a second opinion. That's the appellate system for disputed diagnosis. Because we know it's going to be a disputed diagnosis, let's get the second opinion right up front. We can do that with telehealth. Let the mom appoint her consultant, let the dad appoint her consultant. Now we have a 3-doctor panel to come up with a diagnosis that the court can rely on for its decision making. Okay, so that's how clinical psychology, that's how the healthcare system would address the issues and the concerns of the court. So we want to assess for the delusional thought disorder, for the father's parenting first, for the delusional thought disorder, for the factitious disorder, and then return the diagnosis of child psychological abuse one way or the other so we know what to do and put it on a treatment plan and fix it. The other feature is we're worried about the spousal or partner abuse psychological, and in this case, prominently traumatic grief. Traumatic grief is a grief that cannot be resolved. So here the father has lost bond to his little girls. He's grieving the loss of his children. But his children have died. He hasn't seen them in a long time. Somebody killed his children. He used to be a dad. All of a sudden, he's not a dad to these little girls. And that grief is off the charts. The attachment system, when we lose a parent or we lose a child, we grieve. So his grief is off the charts. But he can't. But the children aren't dead. They're alive. They're over with the mom. So he can't resolve that grief. And so it's a grief that can't be resolved. That's called traumatic grief. And so that's what we're worried with the father. And so this is spousal abuse of the father using the child as a weapon by the mother. Now, we don't tend to think of spousal abuse of the men by women, but here we got emotional, psychological spousal abuse by a very manipulative mother who says, how dare you treat me so bad? You're abusive to me. You yelled at me. You called me names. You're abusing me. Now, she provoked a lot of that, but you're calling me and you got really angry. You're abusive to me. Okay. And so she's got this false belief relative to him. And she wants to punish him for being the bad man. Okay, over in the narcissistic variant, we have the bad mommy pattern. He's punishing the wife mother for being the bad mommy from his childhood. In the borderline version, we have the woman punishing the bad man who traumatized her as a child and that she thinks is going to traumatize, in this case, the 2 little girls. Because, boy, that projective identification on the mother-daughter bond on this type of variant, the borderline variant, and the mother-daughter, that's going to be really high. She's going to see the daughter as herself as a child, and she needs to protect. If it's a mother-son, that's going to be a little bit different pattern. Okay, it's going to be the same borderline spectrum. It's going to be the same issues, but it's going to manifest slightly different because we're going to have a mother and son versus the identification of mother and daughter. We have a different, she's going to use the high affection bond and make her son a warrior against the father kind of stuff, which is going to become more prominent as the child hits 12, 14, 16, some. But I'll talk about that variant in another vignette. So what we do, the first thing we do is a safety plan. That's what we do for all dangerous pathologies: suicide, homicide, abuse. We got abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse. If we fix this child abuse, we'll fix the spousal abuse. If we restore the bond, then we treat the traumatic grief. So first thing we want to do is protectively separate the child or the children from the abusive parent. So that gets them back over with dad, and now we reestablish the bond with the dad without the mother continually trying to produce pathology in the kids. Now, let me say something about the attachment pathology here. That there's a feature, the attachment system is exquisitely sensitive to the signaling of anxiety because it's a predator-driven system. So the origins of the attachment system, excuse me, are the family out in the savannah with lions and hyenas around the community. And so the child is off exploring the world because they have a protective parent who's watching out for them. Okay, that's your secure attachment. They begin to. Now, if the parent signals anxiety, sees a predator and goes, predator, that anxiety signal, the child goes, what? You saw something? And boom, the child gets over close to the parent. And so it's incredibly sensitive to the parent's signaling of anxiety. And one of the ways the parent signals anxiety is called a retrieval behavior. That's where the child's out playing, the parent sees a predator, the parent goes and gets the child. That's called a retrieval behavior. And if a parent does a retrieval behavior with the child goes, what? You saw something? You're worried about something? What's going on? So a retrieval behavior signals anxiety. So on these custody transfers, when the mother gets the child, elicits that anxiety signal from the child, I'm afraid of being with the dad. And then the moment the mother goes in to nurture that and say, oh, you poor thing, she's doing a retrieval behavior. She's saying, stay close to me. That's an authentic fear because there's a predator around. Who's the predator? Dad. So she has now nullified the father as a nurturing, protective parent and defined him as a predator danger that's going to motivate the children to stay close proximity to the mother rather than explore the world. So she's manipulating the attachment networks by signaling anxiety. Okay, so when we get the protective separation, what we're doing is confidently communicating to the children that their father represents a healthy, normal range protective parent. He's a nurturing resource. He's somebody you can go to in times of difficulty and he will help you. He's a normal range. And we need to communicate that with confidence. But we're going to need that mother out of the picture because she's communicating anxiety and worry and she wants the pathology in the child and she's trying to factitious disorder and create the pathology in the child. So we need that period of time to reestablish the children's healthy bond to their dad. Once we get that children stabilized with their dad, then we restore the mom with enough protections in place so that the children don't destabilize again and we don't get back into this pathology. And what that protective step would typically be, what I would often recommend here, is a contingent visitation schedule. This, you rate the children on affection, cooperation, social involvement. As long as they're 3 or higher, everything stays according to the 50-50 court schedule or whatever the court schedule is. But if the children drop to 1s and 2s, particularly Anna, I'm going to be looking for Anna here. I got the ages wrong from the previous one, but we'd be looking at Anna here as lead child, and then Sophia would follow after her. And so we would put, if she drops to 1s and 2s, then that would indicate to us that she's having to collapse to the mother again. The child abuse is resumed. And so Anna and her sister would have to spend 3 consecutive successful days of 3 or higher. and then go back to the custody visitation schedule. That's going to take away the mother's motivation to create pathology in the child because we're disrupting all the secondary gains on her. And I would refer you over to other videos on the contingent visitation schedule to explain how that works. However, we need the diagnosis of that factitious disorder in child abuse, because we're going to be saying if the children have problems with their dad, it's being caused by the mother, not the father. So we need confidence that that's a true statement. So we need to get in there, diagnose a delusion, factitious disorder, child psychological abuse. Then now we have the confidence to say, no, your dad's normal range. And if you're having problems with your dad, it's being caused by your mother. And so we would add the contingent visitation schedule as the treatment for that. Now with family therapy, we would probably want to shift the father's parenting from discipline over to guidance-based strategies. So in this particular variant, anytime he punishes a child, mom's going to use that. Oh, you poor thing, you're being abused by your dad. So we have to eliminate discipline, punishment. And actually, he probably has wonderful girls. They're probably fine. We can use his relationship with the girls. His girls don't need to suffer more by having their toys taken away or being put on timeouts for misbehavior. They're having difficulties. We need him over there offering affection, support, communication, guidance. So we just shift him over from any discipline he's using over to a guidance-based approach. Then we would support breaches and repair sequences because we want to develop psychological autonomy in these girls. We're worried about enmeshment and fused enmeshment and over-involved, intrusive psychological parenting. And so we want to develop that self-authenticity with the children. So that's going to be breach and repair. We would look for those breaches and repairs in the therapy session, and we would know how to work with them because we know all about Edtronic and breach and repair sequences. The other thing is I recommend on this one is what I call the wonderful dad bullet point. And I will offer that typically to the mother in the second session with the mother, is that we're going to make the dad a wonderful dad. Oh my goodness, the girls are going to be going to school and bragging to all the other kids what a wonderful dad their dad is, okay, to everybody else. And mom is not going to like that at all. When you present it to her as part of the assessment, the wonderful dad bullet point, she's going to go, oh, we can't do that, baby, because he doesn't learn. And you see her start to spin on even conceptualizing a wonderful dad and the children bonding to their dad. She can't tolerate that, even that thought. And so that's one way to diagnosing. But then you put it on the treatment plan because actually, I want a wonderful dad for these girls, and I want the girls going to school bragging about how wonderful their dad is. I want them to feel loved on the high affection father-daughter bond. So that would be my bullet point. Guidance-based parenting, remove any barriers to bonding, and get these girls a healthy and normal range relationship with their dad. And then I want to establish boundaries in the household, and I want to monitor the inter-household intrusions using the outcome measure. And I would include an email and text outcome item on the outcome measure. So for the outcome measure, I typically recommend daily rating 7-point Likert scale on affection, the attachment networks, cooperation, emotional regulation, social involvement, mood and arousal. And for this, I would look at putting one on for email and text contact, and I have one for that, where we define what's normal and we rate whether it's been abnormal or normal, and we will be looking for ratings of 3 or higher. And we have the associated clinical sign number 9 that I recommend or suggest will frequently be present. That's for excessive texting or phone contact. And just the research on that from Greenham, Childress, and Pruder on looking at all the 12 associated clinical signs found that in 46 court-involved families who evidenced the 3 diagnostic indicators, ACS9 of the excessive texting was present in 30%. That was the lowest frequency of any of the ACS. So that surprised me a little bit. I'm not, maybe it's underrepresenting. I don't know. I have a YouTube video on this, or maybe it's just not a common feature because it's only part of the borderline spectrum, vulnerable dark triad spectrum. And so it may be even a subcomponent of that. But one of the features about that of excessive texting and intrusion is that every time the child goes to be with the father, the mother's anxiety is going to go through the roof. What she's most worried about is the child's going to bond to the father. And because of her splitting, if the children love him, they're not going to love her. And so she's trying to avoid abandonment by preventing the children bonding to their father. And to a degree, that's kind of reality based because she's a damaged person and she's unstable and is using the kid. And if the kids are allowed to have loving affection relationship with their normal range dad, they're going to go, mom's a little problematic here. And so her fears about exposing her inadequacy and the consequences have a degree of reality based to them. That's where as you come in as a family therapist, you have to address her abandonment fears and you have to address that bond between the children and the mother. Make sure that's a good, healthy, loving bond. For the mother's sake, for the children's sake, that's their mom. And so we want to facilitate that, but just not the intrusive kind of thing and that high anxiety that she's got going and things. And so sometimes, maybe not with this case with Anna and stuff, but sometimes as she gets a little older, 10, 12, maybe even 8, I might explain to Anna that, and here's how I do it. I would turn to the dad in the family therapy session with the 2 kids listening. And I go, you know what, Dad? You know what I'm worried about? I'm worried that the mother is afraid that if your daughters love you, they're not going to love her. I'm afraid that she thinks they have to love either her or you and can't love both. Now, you and I both know that's ridiculous. Kids can love a lot of people. They can love their grandparents or mother, father, everybody. Love doesn't work that way. But I'm worried that the mother believes that. And so she's really worried about that. Hey, so Anna, what can we do about reassuring your mother that you still love her like a whole bunch, and while you're still loving from your dad too? What can we do to reassure your mother? Now, what I'm doing there is I'm giving the children, an explanation for their mother's problematic parenting. I'm also communicating we have to compensate for that, which puts the mother in a position that she's kind of difficult, and we have to compensate for her off that. But I'm also giving the children an explanation that is developmentally appropriate and allows them to still idealize their mother, still get that love from their mother. I'm not blaming the mother, putting the mother down, kind of in that situation. And I'm giving the children permission to take care of their mother, which they're going to do anyway. But I'm beginning to bring it into a conscious decision to take care of their mother rather than her manipulative control situation. So that's what I would be doing and to help stabilize the children to some degree. And then looking at the ratings and saying, kids, as long as you're 3, 4, 5 or higher with your dad, that communicates to me everything's going okay with your mom. If you drop to 1s and 2s, that means your mom's like doing her stuff again, and we need to protect you, and that's why we're going to keep you with your dad for a few more days until you're back to normal range with your dad. That's all we want. There's normal range, and then back to your mom. So if your mom wants to be with you, she better not produce pathology in you, because that's going to get less time for her. And so that's how the contingent visitation schedule is used. So with that, that'll wrap up my second case vignette on the borderline spectrum variant of this pathology. And then I'll do other variants and add other features of the pathology. But with this particular pathology, you're going to find it in 2 variants: the narcissistic dark triad, dark tetrad variant, and the borderline vulnerable dark triad variant. Then you will get patterns within those patterns, but you'll get those. Now, can you get a borderline dad? Yes. Can you get a narcissistic mom? Yes. So you can get the patterns crossing over. And I'll talk about those in future vignettes. What happens when we got a borderline dad or a narcissistic mom? What does that look like? But trauma replicates patterns to work through the trauma. And so if you understand what the trauma patterns are, then the pathology just jumps right up at you because there's a whole pattern. I describe it like putting a puzzle together. And so you got various puzzles. You got trains in the mountains, you got horses in the meadow, and you got a puzzle of cats in the garden. The one we're worried about is cats in the garden. And you're always going to find some specific features of this puzzle. This piece here, this piece here, this piece here. And so you always, however, we don't make the diagnosis of the puzzle cats in the garden based on these 3 pieces or 4 pieces. We put the puzzle together. And you know what? The puzzle is a picture of cats sitting in the garden. There's a watering can, there's flowers, there's a couple birds sitting there. And so we see the pattern played out before us. The issue is if you don't know what the cats in the garden, you're going to be trying to put together, horses in the meadow, and the puzzle pieces don't fix, and none of these things. That's the wrong puzzle. Okay, so you have to know what puzzle pieces you're working at. ADHD is horses in the garden. Autism spectrum is trains in the mountain. We're in attachment pathology. We're over in cats in the garden. So put the puzzle pieces together and it'll all reveal itself. With that, I'm going to head off to the rest of my day and the rest of my work. Take care, everybody.